your art, your writing, your culture is the shell of other men's ambitions, ambitions beyond what you will ever understand.
It's pretty funny. In doing research for this episode and learning about the Red Scare and the techniques that the power elite and their lackeys use to create division, it went from accusations of communist spies, some James Bond type shit, some Manchurian Candidate shit, some really seedy, crazy paranoia. Say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism, but at least it's an ethos. At least like the accusations of communism were tied to some sort of like grand conspiracy or plan. But now it's like trans illegal aliens. People are worried about their kids being having their penises chopped off or weird shit. It's such a great encapsulation of how deranged of a moment that we're in right now. They're like the rotten.com or those weird shock websites like come to fruition. They've like we grew up on these like the nasty 2 girls 1 cup shit that's now like these people are of age to where their like fears are metastasizing. The trauma that they saw on the internet when they were young is metastasizing into these crazy, almost like borderline like perverted David Cronenberg plots that have to do with like, of course, genitals and their assholes and stuff like that. It's crazy shit. Anyways, last episode we broke down how the power elite rule the Western world. Power elite, the CEOs, the corporate chiefs, the military industry, and the government, the state. Together they rule the Western world. They absorbed the Nazi apparatus after World War II. Hitler went too far with the final solution. Otherwise, his war against communism and his ability to give corporations as much control with as little government interference as possible, we loved that. That was great. They absorbed all the things that Hitler did, the Nazi apparatus, including relocating Nazis to different parts of the country to help out on regime changes, etc. They created in the process, created a more palatable diet version of fascism that we see today that's very much predicated on exploiting the third world. So they took all the damage that was going on in the concentration camps and all the nasty wars and the final solution shit against Jewish people and instead they exported that to the third world, keep the myth of capitalism alive, to keep the everything going as smooth as possible. They exported that so that we can't see it. Now today we're going to be looking at what enables the power elite to control people. This has to do with controlling and weaponizing alternative modes of thinking or policing paradigms at odds with their reality. So going back to the goggles metaphor, right? Our goggles we were born with were created by the power elite, right? And, later on in life, sometimes, you start to take them off and be like, why am I wearing, like, let me try another one. And it's like, there is a war against picking up an alternative pair of goggles to view the world in a different way. This all is very relevant. It's all very relevant to today, like, what started as relatively quaint accusations of communist secret agents infiltrating America's institutions, otherwise known as the Red Scare, is now morphed into like a much weirder and disturbing imaginary fears. Like some examples of what's going on right now, student activists who protest the political ideology of a nation state are now labeled anti-Semitic agents of Iran. So if you have a problem with Israel's ongoing genocide of Palestine, then that's anti-Semitic. It's not about killing children is no longer a red line. It's anti-Semitic to have a problem with that. Individuals who identify as genders not assigned to them at birth are accused of trying to groom children and taking part in a Chinese psyop to make America gay and woke. That's an interesting one, by the way. That's like a lot of imagery going on there. I'm just imagining like Xi Jinping in like a boardroom, like coming up with the idea, or like is like being pitched the idea of like turning America trans. That would be one hell of a, I would love to just see a documentary on that. Leftists who don't want to vote for Kamala Harris are smeared as privileged fascist sympathizers who are paid by Russia. If you anyone who's been at a party and who's like expressed some sort of hesitance in voting for Kamala Harris or Biden for that matter last election, or Hillary for that last election, you're immediately smeared, of like, they assume you're a Trump supporter, right? Or, or maybe if you're a Trump supporter and you say, or like if you're on the right and you are like, I just don't feel comfortable with this Trump thing, then, oh, what? You're a commie, queer, anarchist. These are all alternate goggles, right? And there's this immediate blowback. There's a pushback to anything that's kind of alternative. It can be viewed as an overt attempt at a course correction, right? Keeping the populace confined to the corporate sanctioned goggles so that the power elite can reliably continue their world domination. In addition to that, it's an obvious distraction, right? Like we all know when you see Donald Trump talk about immigrants eating pets, or when you see Kamala just like kind of say some sort of like ambiguous like racial thing, about like in solidarity with some like Black Lives Matter or something, but despite not really having any sort of policies to show for it. There are obviously, I correctly identify those things as distractions. That's been a long time thing, And so, and all these things are very much distractions from like the slow chipping away of our safety, our social safety nets and regular apparatus, and in some cases our democracy itself. Like it's never the corporations buying politicians that's the problem. It's always the lowest rungs of society, right? Like the most vulnerable. It's always immigrants, people that live alternative lifestyles to whatever the norm is, or Russian interference, right? That's the go-to. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. But everyone knows these messages are directly beamed from the power elite. They all inevitably, right or left, they all come down to benefit the same group of people that we've discussed on this podcast. But I want to look at how an individual can truly think this way. Because I firmly believe that, like, it's my personal belief that I don't think any individual is inherently bad, right? It's more like bad information, bad upbringing, etc. So what makes them susceptible to this control? That's what we're going to talk about. What primes them for suspicion and conflict? Like, why do the rural white suburban parents comfortably making 6 figures a year care about some trans kid on the other side of the country? Right? Like, that's not a threat to them at all whatsoever. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but trans people must make up well under 1% of the population. It's got to be much lower than that. And the fact that the outsized attention they get, particularly on the right, is incredible. Or like why would a white suburban family worry about immigrants moving into a small town 6 states away from them? Like Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. Have you ever been to Ohio? I haven't been to Ohio. I don't plan on going to fucking Ohio. But like, why would someone in Florida give a shit about 20,000 Haitian immigrants moving to Springfield, Ohio? Like why? What is priming them to care about these things? I want to look at the propensity for paranoia, where the fear came from, and then talk about the inception of its weaponization and how this helps shape our reality, literally and figuratively. And then touch on like these alternative modes of thought very briefly, at one point that were commonplace in our country before being essentially outlawed by the power elite.
Right away, right
Okay, so where we start is post-World War II, right? Nazis have fallen, Hitler's dead. We talked about how a lot of the Nazis were relocated, but let's just move past that. It was a long time ago. If you look at America as a country, it had just gone through the Great Depression and then a World War II, a existential, all hands on deck success in a war, right? That like saw their entire way of life, threatened, the Western way of life threatened, and they triumphed. They all came together and they beat the bad guys. The Nazis were the fucking bad guys. They were the most evil army in contemporary history, modern history rather. And you can only imagine that, the vibes were off the chart in that time. There's this renewed sense that they can achieve anything, that a better life is not only possible, but that like people are entitled to it. There was an immense sense of accomplishment and optimism among Americans. There was an emphasis on freedom, but particularly in the midst of the Great Depression, freedom from poverty, exploitation, and suffering. The idea that, like, you know, we don't need to be poor in this country. Like, there doesn't need to be poor people. There doesn't need to be hunger. Like, you know, we just defeated the fucking Nazis, like, together. We were the Americans that beat the Nazis and saved the world. We can achieve anything. We, a sense of unity, America, together. And, you know, practically speaking, you know, that meant establishing bureaucracies to regulate capitalism for the benefit of everyone. You know, there's a really, I think the point is there's a big unity. And this is also, you know, intertwining the Great Depression and World War II is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's The New Deal. In other words, government. You know, it's a government policy that had carried the country through an economic depression and through a triumphant victory in a world war. And the New Deal was successful because it focused on the 3 R's: relief for the unemployed and for the poor, recovery of the economy back to normal levels, and reform of the financial system to prevent a repeat of the Depression. And it fucking worked. It worked. Government policy saved the economy and lifted many of the country's unemployed and poor out of unprecedented levels of poverty. The government stepped in when business failed, implemented policy, and saved the country. Imagine the government doing anything like that now. Like, imagine like a president using an executive order or Congress pushing through anything even remotely progressive or helpful as like something like Social Security, which was a part of the New Deal. It's unheard of. I mean, like, look at what happened with Bernie Sanders when he even just like threatened with just talked about the idea of single payer healthcare, reforming healthcare so that like it could be a right, a human right. He was tarred and feathered by his own party. The Democratic establishment tore his ass up. I don't know the exact numbers. I'll post them, but people in this country, they want single payer healthcare. No one wants to pay for health insurance, especially when it fucking sucks. But look at Bernie. He puts that forward and he's torn up. Obama just had to step in and be like, nope. In other words, the power elite has won. We can't even dream of government being used in a helpful way anymore. And we're going to see why. Now, knowing what we know about the power elite and their psychotic determination to extract every dollar and resource from this planet, you can imagine the last R in reform, the last R in the 3 R's did not sit well with them. Now, control over the financial sector is a crucial part of accumulating godlike power that they sure as fuck were not about to just roll over and cede to the power of the democratically elected government. Oh.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
Power elite needs to find a messaging. They need to redo their messaging. And the foundational idea that's always permeated through the power elite begins to crystallize, right? An idea that the ruling class of every era inherently believed. How else do you justify slavery or hoarding resources from your peers? This age-old idea of selfishness and moralized greed needed rebranding for the modern era, though, especially given the historical perspective. And this idea gets a new life in Austrian nerd Friedrich von Hayek. He was a super rich dude born into a super wealthy family of doctors and college professors. But he was an extremely influential figure, particularly in the ideology of libertarianism. Now, I know that Ayn Rand is like the god emperor of libertarianism, and I know they had a little bit of beef, or some people are like Hayek people, and some people are whatever. They're all nerds. You can look into it. It's kind of boring. But anyways, Hayek believed that almost all attempts by the government to plan society would always inevitably lead to tyranny and serfdom. His example being the Soviet Union, who attempted to plan every aspect of civil life, being a communist country. Friedrich von Hayek would write a very influential book in 1944 called The Road to Serfdom. And this was very influential among the power elite. This gave form to a lot of their more ambiguous ideas of power, right? New Deal government style being a big threat to their control over the financial sector and the world. In the welfare state, he saw tyranny, right? It wasn't helping people, it was tyranny. It was taking away their control. He believed the only way for a society to avoid tyranny was through free markets, okay, where individuals followed their own self-interests. This would produce a self-directing, automatic system. Hayek rejected altruism and instead emphasized selfishness, literally selfishness. From his worldview, communists exuded the arrogance of humility. So and I want to talk about this, and we'll touch on this, but selfishness, he thought people were inherently selfish. That was kind of his idea. And this is just so insane to me, when given the time and the period, coming off the World War, where everybody kind of came together, multiple countries, the Allied forces come together in an unprecedented way. I just feel like that in definition is not selfish. You can just picture the elitist brain that this nerd had. His stance is very convenient to capitalism. It's very convenient to the success of people like his family and people he probably grew up with. There's a lot of, selfishness in his ideas. So if you're in the power elite or you're an anti-New Deal conservative, what is the practical application of this nerd's theory? How do you implement selfishness into the government, economy, and society?
One other thing. I think it rips through your clothes when it takes you over. Windows found some shredded long johns, but the name tag was missing. They could be anybody's. Nobody trusts anybody now. We're all very tired. Nobody trusts anybody now. There's nothing else I can do. Just wait.
So we return to our good old friend Alan Dulles, who is now, post-World War II, he's back with Sullivan and Cromwell, his law firm, that, if you remember correctly, represented the interests of Nazis, multiple Nazis, after World War II, and also helped them launder their money, Nazi gold, into America, which we'll talk about more in a sec. So World War II is over, and Alan and his clients in the power elite are concerned about the growing threat of communism. So in other words, on the other side of the world, they wear different goggles. And despite America easily outnumbering the communist regime at the time with military strength and literal nukes, the idea, especially in the wake of fascism being defeated, the idea of communism had the potential to spread through Europe, particularly in a post-war Europe. So there's certain areas like Italy and some other countries that are, particularly vulnerable at this time and looking for, they'd kick the fascists out and they're looking for towards the future. Places like France. And this is this breeding ground for something like communism, especially on the backs of all this optimism post-World War II. The power elite, led by Alan Dulles at the time, was terrified of this in particular. To the power elite, communism was incompatible with their version of selfishness, as we discussed. If you recall, the power elite, their ideal form of government was one that gave corporations as much power as possible. Hence why they, had a kinship with the Nazis, And communism spits in the face of that. It's the complete opposite. But unlike the Nazis who essentially seized power, Hitler came in and seized power through violent means in some cases. The power elite, they're smart in that they know, they're trying to embrace this new diet version of fascism that doesn't rely on very unpalatable and violent stuff like that, for instance, like violent seize of power. So they realize if they're going to take power and defeat communism, then we all have to wear their goggles, free market selfishness goggles, then they're going to have to do so through a very slick propaganda effort. They're going to have to rewire the way in which we think. They're going to have to till the soil and create the conditions in which they can thrive, in which this way of thinking can thrive. And I just want to point out, too, that there's an irony here that America, and this is going to be a theme that we're going to explore in great depth going forward, including with a different show I'm excited about. But the irony being that a lot of these communist threats, right, were like completely legitimate political parties in foreign countries. You know, in that like large populations of people from these sovereign nations genuinely supported communism. You can have your opinions of communism one way or another, but another country that is not America is having an election and there is a communist party and they are popular. So it's this idea of, you know, America meddling in other people's business. So the CIA doesn't exist quite yet. And Alan Dulles has to take matters into his own hands, so to speak. So Alan Dulles organizes the power elite, gets a bunch of money together, of which they have an unlimited supply of at this time, and they create the National Committee for a Free Europe. It's an organization. General Dwight Eisenhower, Hollywood director Cecil B. DeMille, and news magnate Henry Luce, who will be making an appearance later on. They channeled funds into anti-communist European groups and funded massive propaganda efforts, hoping to sway elections. This is how it started. And so straight off the bat, $2 million of their budget came directly from Nazi gold that Alan Dulles had seized in World War II. Just a little fun fact. So genocide gold funded this power elite, a bunch of rich people's clandestine organization. It's funny how like the richest people always find a way to like borrow or scam money from the poorest people. So the first real testing ground of this is 1948. This is post-war. Italy's having what I believe is their first democratic elections. Italy's Communist Party was on the verge of winning a national election by popular vote. Italy had seen firsthand what fascism, could do, and this election was the beginning of a new era of Italian politics. The wound of fascism was fresh. Long story short, Alan Dulles raised millions of dollars from the power elite to tilt the Italian election in favor of a Christian Democrat with ties to America. And this is kind of a sneak peek to episode 3, because we'll go into a lot of this more in depth next episode, but this was just the very beginning of what the CIA and U.S. government would go on to do globally for the rest of the century, basically directly interfering with other countries' elections, governments, and societies to ensure that no alternative to their worldview would ever succeed. And this was achieved from everything from intricate propaganda efforts all the way to literally just assassinating the public figures they didn't like.
How do you know all this? It was the only one I wasn't 100% on. I should have my fucking head examined going ahead when I wasn't 100%. That's your proof? You don't need proof when you have instinct. I ignored it before, but no more. You lost your fucking mind.
Joe, you're making a terrible mistake I'm not gonna let you make.
Come on, guys. Nobody wants this. We're supposed to be fucking professionals.
So I stumbled upon this in the terrific Adam Curtis docu-series called The Trap. I believe it's episode 1. But the power elite and its in-between types finally found a coherent strategy that encapsulated the Austrian nerds' ideas of selfishness. A theory that can not only fight their communist enemy, but frame the fight in a binary way that would be impossible to defend. So the abstract idea of selfishness being crystallized into a theory. A Cold War strategy that would go on to define culture to this day. Game theory. So game theory started as a way to strategically analyze poker games. Basically what it says is you and your enemy are playing the same game, and therefore you'll use the same strategies to achieve the same desired outcome. And this was studied very closely and popularized by the RAND Corporation, which was a think tank originally financed by the Ford Foundation, so connected to the power elite. What they do is they just throw a bunch of money towards a bunch of nerds and have them come up with ideas that confirm their own previously held biases. That's how think tanks work. And then they can turn that into public policy, etc. It gives otherwise unpopular ideas like all of humans are selfish some legitimacy. If you have a bunch of nerds write a paper about it and then do an all-out press release, press tour with all the media, people then just assume that it's true, right? So the RAND Corporation was specifically studying a way in which America can contend with the rising threat of communism and the Cold War that was developing. And they found game theory to be the ideal strategy. Because this way they thought that they could figure out exactly what the Soviets were doing and what they would do. And this was based off mutual fear and self-interest. So viewing it like a poker game, in which there's a set of rules and we're both playing the same game, the same desired outcome, American foreign policy was dictated off what we believed the enemy would do. So if you're a ruthless psychopath and you're looking at a room full of other people, you're going to assume that they're all ruthless psychopaths because you're a ruthless psychopath. So you can kind of already see the obvious problem with game theory or thinking like this. It completely ignores the difference in cultures and language, history, religions, and whatnot of all other countries. It's weird to predict what an entire complex society would do with such certainty. It imposes on other countries our leaders' ideas of those things. And remember, our ideas by our leaders and the power elite at the time that humans were motivated purely by self-interest and distrusted those around them. So the Rand Corporation popularizes game theory as a means of dealing with the Cold War. But this would eventually go far beyond foreign policy and military strategy because the power elite, remember, must control and calibrate our goggles to the frequency they need. They need to control our minds. No, the days of Hitler taking over are over. They must create the conditions that allow their worldview to grow and thrive. And importantly, under Diet fascism, the Fourth Reich, they cannot do this through force and military might. So enter the brilliant mind of John Nash, who's working as a consultant for the Rand Corporation. And you may recognize him as the character Russell Crowe played in that extremely overrated Best Picture winning movie, A Beautiful Mind. John Nash is working as a consultant for the Rand Corporation, and he applies game theory to all forms of human interaction, supposing that all human behavior was no different than that of the Cold War. And he actually won the Nobel Prize for this, which is crazy. So he saw this as a good thing, that society could be run on this paradigm. Everyone's self-interest can be perfectly balanced against each other, he thought. If we're all playing the same game, then all of us want the same outcomes. It'd be very easy to set society up in a way accordingly. It makes things, all this chaotic world we live in, so much more predictable. He saw everyone as being separate from one another, doing something inherently non-cooperative. One of the fundamental ideas of game theory and the way in which he saw that people interacted within game theory was something called the sucker payoff, or the prisoner's dilemma. I think the prisoner's dilemma is a better way of describing it. In the 1950s, economists created the prisoner's dilemma, a game theory that demonstrates how two individuals operating in the same system must choose between cooperation or defection. The experiment is presented as two criminals who committed a major crime and are caught by police. However, the police only have enough evidence to charge them with a minor crime, represented as -1. The criminals then become prisoners and are separated. The police give each of them an opportunity to privately confess and snitch on their partner in crime. If one prisoner snitches or defects and the other one stays silent, then the prisoner who snitched gets rewarded with their freedom, represented here as 0, and the other gets the maximum sentence, represented as -2. This creates an incentive to be a rat. However, if both prisoners snitch on each other, then they both get the maximum sentence and mutually end up in the suboptimal situation. So basically, John Nash is saying that if faced with this scenario, we will snitch on our associate, on our partner, on our fellow human in order to have a more desirable outcome. At the end of the day, we're all snitches, and first and foremost, we are concerned with ourselves. This is the worldview of a nerd and a coward. In this paradigm, he's saying everybody would need to be suspicious and distrustful of their neighbors or anyone around them at any moment. The cohesion and trust you feel for your neighbors, the desire to help out a friend, or even the love you feel between you and your spouse, it's manipulation. It's a complex form of give and take. And all connections towards other people or trust is a liability. So love wasn't love. It was actually a power struggle between two individuals who were controlling one another for their own self-interest. And it's worth pointing out, too, the man that John Nash, the guy who popularized this and would win the Nobel Prize for it, would come to realize he was suffering from, much later, would come to realize he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and in which he thought he was being followed by communist spies. I'd say that checks out. So we live in a world full of snitches where everybody's out to get us. You can't trust anyone. To trust is to be weak. These men had and still do a supremely retarded sense of connection to the world. One built on suspicion and paranoia. I would also add a perverted sense of intimacy and love, if that's what they think. I mean, that's really sad to think that if you truly were to feel that everyone in your life was trying to use you, that sucks, man. That sucks. So apply this to where we were in the story post World War II, we can't agree to disarm and pursue peace with our enemy. We must assume that they will simply betray us. The Soviet Union, if there is no unity, they will betray us. It's just under game theory, it's a fact. Because in game theory, we both want the same goal, and we'll throw ethics or altruism out the window in order to achieve it. If you don't do it, then someone else will. So more nukes, more military bases, more sanctions, more propaganda. Whatever they do, we got to do twice as much. And even if they're not doing it, we have to do it because they will do it, because we're playing the same game and we're both desiring the same outcome. If they take it to 10, we got to take it to 11. Simply disarming and projecting vulnerability in the name of solidarity or something like that, suicide, no chance. And just a side tangent on game theory, this is totally makes sense for America, and you still totally see this shit, this mode of thinking primarily in the right wing. Obvious examples now is, rhetoric towards immigrants. But you also see this in like men's rights, incel nerds on fucking YouTube that push this attitude toward dating women or whatever, one based on like aggression and domination or like pickup artist shit, like it's a game. And like, to them, the idea of partnership based on unconditional love, like can't be fathomed. The idea of like selflessness is just like, there's no chance. It's always a battle of control. They must control before they are betrayed. Any glance at another man is a hint of what's to come. Like all women are bitches. So you're just like, preemptively treating them like shit because then that they're going to leave you as soon as they find a richer guy or some shit like that, which is just absurd. Whatever. Maybe that's some people's experience, but I just say, touch grass and chill. Another thing too is like, I can't help but think about like rappers I've listened to, like whether it's Wu-Tang Clan or Mobb Deep or some, people that like talk very 50 Cent, people that talk like very in depth about snitching and the 21 Savage Metro Boomin mixtape, where they have that whole thing with Morgan Freeman doing the snitch thing. Like, I'd wonder what they would think about the Austrian nerd and John Nash's idea of selfishness and snitching being the default mode or the right thing to do. Through that paradigm, it makes like hip hop be extremely countercultural, which is kind of cool actually. Maybe that's why hip hop is just so dope and why like younger people are gravitate towards it, because they actually like the rappers are singing. Whether or not they practice it's a different thing, but the characters they portray in their rap music have a sense of honor that is so antithetical to role models or politicians of our time. And just to be fair, I have no idea, in the prisoner's dilemma, if I'm brought in and me and a partner have committed a major crime, and I have no idea how I would react, just to be fair. Like, maybe I would snitch. Maybe I would be a pathetic little weasel. All I know is I would like to think that in most circumstances, I wouldn't sell out someone else for personal gain. I would like to think so. I would try to do that. I'm going to try to raise my kids to not do that. But you can see the landlord, ruthless Wall Street business mentality begin to arise from the mud of this ideological framework. This is very much the foundation for thinking selfishly.
I was a victim too. At least my wife was. She had friends who were socialists.
Oh my God.
Well, we all make mistakes.
It's funny. People talk about freedom of speech in America a lot, and I'm a big proponent of that. I think it's really important. Yet there is so few truly alternative modes of thought in America. Even back in like the 20s and 30s, like there were communists. There were actual alternative ideas of how to run a society by like regular working class people. Before the internet or cable news, people would read books and pamphlets and make decisions based off like what made sense for them in their community. There wasn't this like identity politics as their shit is today, That's why unions were a lot stronger. That's why people like communities were a lot tighter. There was no baggage or attachment necessarily like there is now to thinking about alternate forms of government. And so if we look at the two big alternate forms of government that have always been big and are still big, we got communism and socialism. Communism is a political and economic system that aims to create a classless society where everybody shares the benefit of labor equally. Three big hits on communism is public ownership. The public owns and controls the major means of production, such as factories and mines. There is no private property. Communism rejects private property and currency. Wealth distribution. Wealth is divided among citizens equally or according to individual needs. And then socialism, by contrast, is a political and economic system that aims to create a more equal society by sharing the ownership of property and the means of production. It is similar to communism in that the public owns and controls the major means of production, such as factories and mines and major manufacturing and stuff like that. But it differs in property ownership. Individuals under socialism can own property and possess currency. So there's still an economy similar to a capitalist society. And income distribution under socialism is different as well. Individual wealth accumulation is permitted, and which does occasionally result in wage inequality. So there is slight inequality under socialism, but the highest paid people will make only a few times more than the lowest paid due to aggressive taxation on the wealthiest earners. And those are just communism and socialism in its purest forms. And that doesn't really exist, or never really did exist, and still doesn't really exist. It's hard to find an example of both systems being used in their purest forms. That just like in America, like we aren't purely a capitalist society. You can't say that. The state still regulates the markets and regularly subsidizes large corporations with bailouts and subsidies, artificially keeping the economy going, along with significant public investment in the military. So like if you look at two of the poster child models, like for communists, China is communist in name and in framework, but also quasi-capitalist by allowing private ownership of companies whose profits are retained by ownership rather than being spread out around the population. However, it's worth noting that the government does own some of the country's largest companies and is heavily involved in almost all others it doesn't own outright. So China's different. There's still rich people that accumulate wealth in China. And I think there's still like small business owners. However, the government is incredibly involved. You have to basically go through the government for everything. On the other side is the Nordic model, Sweden. And Sweden itself is held up as this poster child of socialism, but in reality, it's not pure socialism either. While they do have a robust social spending programs such as free healthcare and education, their businesses are mostly privately owned, and the profits, after taxes again, are wholly retained by their owners. So basically, it's kind of what Bernie's advocating for America is like, and it's something that we kind of already do with military spending and we do have social services and social security and stuff like that. So you can see how like no purism exists, right? Democracies and theories should be mishmashers of different ideas and theories, right? We take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. No, I don't think anyone wants to live in like a pure system of capitalism or communism, whatever. Maybe you do, whatever, that's fine. It's just that I think so much of the discourse is lost in in a ideological purism, which I think just misses the point of like somebody being like having communist ideas. And we'll see why that's relevant when we talk about the Red Scare here. So with the newly defined game theory playbook, the power elite led by Alan Dulles, the head honcho, the head coach, had successfully established a paranoia contagion that was sweeping through the country. So that neighbor that you just simply disagreed with on a basic political topic, he's now potentially a threat to your freedom. Be very suspicious. So with game theory, the power elite had found their way to bludgeon back all the progress the New Deal and social spending Democrats had made that we talked about earlier. Post-World War II, New Deal brings it out, wants to regulate the markets. The power elite says no. They find out about game theory. They now find a way to frame it so that all the progress the New Deal has made, they can push it back, bang them over the head with their own success. The master plan, if you zoom out, it's really not that crazy. It's basically just exploiting the Cold War by calling their enemies communists and accusing them of being secret agents for the Soviet Union, which I think sounds kind of cool, but back then it was terrifying. So we get our first taste of the Red Scare during the 1946 California election between Republican Richard Nixon and Democrat Jerry Voorhis, might be pronouncing that wrong, Voorhis, for a seat in the United States House of Representatives. Jerry Voorhis was this really exciting up-and-coming New Deal Democrat. He was extremely suspicious of the power elite's growing influence in politics. In 1943, he famously blocked multiple sweetheart deals between the U.S. military and Standard Oil some of which were to allow offshore drilling along the coast of California, so you can thank him for that. He also was very suspicious and had a lot of distrust of Alan Dulles, and was perpetually threatening to shine a light on his dealings with Nazis during World War II. This guy would be considered woke now. Needless to say, he kicked the hornet's nest and drew the full attention of the power elite. Voorhis had to go. He had to go. So Richard Nixon, the Republican out of California, was enlisted by the power elite to run against Voorhis. And it was the perfect opportunity for them to test out their new bag of tricks, aka calling your opponent a communist. The campaign viciously attacked and smeared Voorhis as a Communist Party sympathizer and a tool of red-dominated labor unions. They even had anonymous callers call voters reading from a script that informed them, "This is your friend, but I can't tell you who I am. Did you know that Jerry Forrest is a communist?" I'd assume like click and hang up after that, but that's the quote that they have. I think that's so silly that like I just would love to hear samples of that phone call. Like, who is this? Like, why are you telling me this? Like, who the fuck is Jerry Voorhis? And the irony of this is that Jerry Voorhis was a pretty outspoken critic of the Soviet Union. He even went as far as spearheading a bill in 1940 that required political groups funded by foreign powers to register with the government. None of that mattered, obviously, to Republicans and to the power elite. It was Voorhis' support for the New Deal programs like school lunches and Social Security that Nixon's campaign attacked as communist. So really, it was the things that they were celebrating. They turned their successes against them. Under this new paradigm, they were able to point to those things and identify it as communist. Nixon would go on to win 56% of the vote. And years later, he would even admit to his staffer that he was fully aware that Voorhis wasn't a communist. A little fun fact, too, is Nixon was well compensated. He, upon moving to Washington, D.C., he did so with an additional $10,000 in his bank account, which is equivalent to $130,000 of our time, and drove to Washington, D.C. in a brand new Ford. Wonder where he got that. So this laid the groundwork for the new era of politics, activating the seeds of paranoia planted with game theory, right? One based on stoking fears in the name of advancing the power elite's grasp over the world, disarming the government of its ability to regulate the power elite, and redefining what it meant to be American. Update for the new power goggles, American mode. And this is their version of American. And it's worth looking into this because the New Deal, it describes paradigm very well, the way that the game theory interacts with the New Deal. The way that the New Deal can never survive in the game theory paradigm, under the game theory goggles. In the New Deal, global institutions will channel investments to like needy countries for the broadest possible public good, rather than like the greatest private gain. So it's this idea of like, we're spending money on everybody. Or the idea of suggesting they work with the Soviet Union. Rather than become an enemy and jump right into this, we just defeated the Nazis together. Let's work together. You have your country, we have ours. Let's figure something out. This doesn't work under game theory. The prisoner's dilemma, the two prisoners can't mutually come together. The prisoners always snitch on each other, remember in game theory. Public spending, cooperation with the Soviet Union, that's being the prisoner that's getting snitched on. That's getting charged with the maximum crime. That's being the sucker. Private spending, aggression towards the Soviet Union, that's being the snitcher. That's snitching on your partner to get the desirable outcome. This is the way they think under game theory. This is the way the world was shaped under game theory. It was time for the power elite to enter scoundrel mode.
There's just one thing, babe. I'd be a lot happier if we could just settle on the number of communists I know there are in the Defense Department. I mean, the way you keep changing the figures on me all the time, it makes me look like some kind of a nut, like an idiot. You know, the boys were even starting to kid me about it. Well, just yesterday in the cloakroom, they said, "Hey, Johnny."
Well, you're going to look like an even bigger idiot if you don't get in there and do exactly what you're told.
Babe,
Who are they writing about all over this country, and what are they saying? Are they saying, are there any communists in the Defense Department? Of course not. They're saying, how many communists are there in the Defense Department? So just stop talking like an expert all of a sudden and get out there and say what you're supposed to say.
Come on, babe.
I'm sorry, hon. Would it really make it easier for you if we settled on just one number?
Yeah. Just one real simple number that'd be easy for me to remember. There are exactly 57 card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the Department of Defense at this time. A point of order.
So upon Nixon winning and joining Congress, we entered the period of the Red Scare. And this would mark an all-out assault on the New Deal Democrats and the so-called communist sympathizers. Nixon served on the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a committee set up in the late 30s to investigate any and all suspected threats of subversion or propaganda. And Nixon sat on that committee. This gave him unrivaled access to shape a narrative that America was under attack by subversive communists. So power elite finally have their puppet in Richard Nixon, and this is their first ability to fight their adversaries, the New Deal Democrats, in a way that is diet fascist, right? Can't put their enemies in concentration camps anymore. That was no good, no bueno. This is the new 2.0, the Fourth Reich. And the Fourth Reich doesn't use upfront violence. That's reserved for brown people in the third world. At home, domestically, they have to outsmart them with propaganda. They have to make the people believe through their goggles. They got to be wearing the same goggles. So now they have their puppet in government who can enact this in a semi-legitimate way. The first target on their list is Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss would become to be known as the first high-profile person accused of espionage during the Red Scare. Hiss was a brilliant law student, became a powerful government attorney, and one of FDR's right-hand man, playing a key role in the formation of the United Nations. He was also, it's worth mentioning, and you'll find this as a trend, he was a very good-looking person, and basically everything that eluded Nixon's ugly ass and the rest of some of those warlocks in the power elite. Just a little trend that's worth paying attention to. I think the knives get extra sharp when the communist or the enemy is attractive. So it all started when just Hiss was spuriously accused by a journalist for being a Russian asset. And that journalist was Whittaker Chambers, who was a writer at Time magazine, which was owned by prominent member of the power elite, Henry Luce. Henry Luce, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but basically one of the guys that helped fund the National Committee for a Free Europe that would go on and tilt the Italian election to a Christian Democrat instead of the popular Communist Party. So one of the reporters that works for his magazine just basically comes out and says, Alger Hiss is a communist spy. He has ties to communism. He is leaking government secrets to communist governments. And he said this because Whittaker Chambers actually ended up being caught as a spy, and so he was saying, yeah, I'm a spy, but also so is he. But this first attempt to take down their enemies through the Red Scare proved to be pretty difficult because Alger Hiss was a very well-respected figure in Washington, with both sides vouching for his character, Republican and Democrats. In fact, Foster Dulles himself had chosen Alger Hiss to take over his position at the Carnegie Endowment, another think tank for rich people. But so he trusted him enough initially, a couple years prior to taking over this position. So this is going to be a really delicate balance for them to have to kind of take out this guy that was super popular. Basically, he survived multiple iterations of their attempts at trying to stilt him or get him to admit that he was a communist or that he knew certain people. It got to the point where it got kind of ridiculous. It got to the point where Alan Foster Dulles had to step in and testify against him. They had created this, what is now widely believed to be a fake story. You can look it up, called the Pumpkin Papers. But basically, Chambers said that he had handwritten letters from Hiss saying that he was proving that he was a communist spy, whatever. I think the letters had been proven to be fake, and they even had CIA adjacent came out saying that they recreated the typewriter that Hiss had to type out the letter so that it would look like it was written by him or something like that. You can do your own research on that. But basically, that had put Hiss like right against his back up against the wall. And it was Alan Dulles that stepped up to the plate and testified against his old friend, his one-time friend, using his authority to push the boulder just over the hill and officially take out the Red Scare's first victim. Alan Dulles lended an incredible amount of legitimacy to kind of a failing attempt at convicting this guy. And he mostly did this by changing public opinion. So Alger Hiss would go on to be convicted of perjury and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. And it's important to realize he was not convicted of treason, the initial charge. It was perjury. They found him lying. And here's the reality you'll see with a lot of this, and like with a lot of criticism in general of a lot of stuff. Like, the reality is that, you know, he was a loyal American, but that he definitely ran in left-wing circles like all these people did. A lot of the FDR New Deal guys did. And those left-wing circles most definitely had connections to communists. And he tried to hide this in public testimony because, you know, it's not a good look, and he was under so much heightened pressure. And, you know, by lying about it, that's what ended up fucking him over. But this is something that's so true, and why it's so effective is that there is kernels of truth to this stuff. Like, are there, for instance, if you just want to dip out of the past really quick and go into the future, like, are there examples of like gangsters coming across the border and immigrants? Of course there are. Are there people paid by Russia to like talk shit about Ukraine and stuff? Yeah, there definitely are. But the real problem is we're losing nuance here. Just because some of those things are true doesn't lend credence or confirm the overarching narrative. In this case, that Alger Hiss was a communist spy or some sort, you know. But there, again, game theory is changing the way that tilling the soil and creating the conditions in which even associating with a communist is now communism. It didn't used to be before. So with Hiss down, the next guy up was Harry Dexter White. He was a government economist who was a chief architect in New Deal policy, among many other accomplishments. Some people lauded him as the most important economist of the 20th century. And he had, you know, the reason why the power elite wanted him gone is he had really big plans for a post-war landscape that included channeling investments to developing countries across the globe in an attempt to rebuild and empower the world. He was also very adamant about bringing the Soviet Union into post-war international framework, like in the name of world peace. Like, he wanted them involved in conversations for what the world would look like post-World War II. So again, opposite of game theory. Not snitching. He's not snitching. He's not a snitch. The biggest issue for the power elite, though, was of where he wanted to redirect money, and that was globally out of America. Wall Street hated the idea of powering potential competitors in global capital markets. So Harry needed to go. This one's a long and wild story that I suggest you look up, but basically the power elite lucked out on this one because it was not going well at all, kind of like the Alger Hiss stuff. These public trials would bring out 2 shit shows of a witness, one of which would show up drunk and ended up being like a complete alcoholic and like fucking up her testimonies and whatnot. And the other one was Chambers, the guy from the previous one. Basically, they ended up running old Harry Dexter White through the ringer so bad that he had a heart attack and died. Straight up. There's no one that believes that Harry Dexter White in reality was a communist or an agent of Soviet Union. And no doubt, just like Alger Hiss, he ran in left-wing circles and no doubt came into contact with many communists, many of which probably were connected to the government in Soviet Union. So by 1952, Nixon's success at crippling the New Deal progressive wing had earned him a spot as the vice president to Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration. Eisenhower's administration was overflowing with the who's who of the power elite, military, industry, finance, you name it. The swamp, if you will. Alan Dulles was finally officially made the head of the CIA, and his brother Foster was head of the State Department. And the Red Scare would continue on even without Nixon. This time under the command of Senator Joseph McCarthy, which is a whole story we won't get into on this podcast, but is well worth looking into. It's very sad, but basically Joseph McCarthy is this wild, crazy alcoholic dude whose entire career was financed by owners of Pepsi Cola bottling companies and private construction moguls, yet another orc of the power elite. The whole era of the Red Scare under Joseph McCarthy would come to be known as McCarthyism. And it would claim the careers of politicians, journalists, writers, actors, even private citizens. It completely dismantled a lot of Hollywood. People like Charlie Chaplin, even, having to flee the country, not being able to work. And the scope was even expanded to simply publicly outing closeted homosexuals, for instance, or any other forms of like alternative thought for the moment. Even simply like American scholars of communism were put in the hot seat to be smeared and discredited, purging them from the ranks of government. So like people that like went to school, like Americans who got degrees in like political science, who were like experts consulting and advising governments, agencies on communism and how they are now the problem. So it got so out of hand that even like learning about these things would signal to these guys that you weren't, you could be a traitor. You could snitch on them. Learning, being educated about things is now officially, you are now officially a gay, trans, illegal immigrant. So there you have it. The Mexican's going to take your job. Your girlfriend's going to fuck some other guy. Trans people are going to steal your kids' genitals. Everybody around you is just waiting to stab you in the back and take your house and your money and your guns, and you better do it first. Because if you don't do it, someone else will. That's the legacy of game theory, and that's why we've been predisposed. That's the frequency they've set our goggles to. So we look and view the world through that. When you see the image of the migrant hopping the fence, and you just think about, you get scared, right? Your clearly defined borders that, whether it's your house or your apartment or your living room that you've been confined to, borders, you're seeing everything when it's encroached upon. Someone's going to steal your material possessions. This is the world. This is the frequency we're living. These are the goggles. This is what they're set to. And when we view things through this, no wonder we're so scared. Like, no wonder people, the well-off family in the suburbs of Connecticut is scared of fucking Honduran immigrants with their children in El Paso, right? It's like, it's because it's so sunken into our paradigm that we can't unsee it. To borrow on some terminology from episode 1 too, it's the final synthesis of business-brained thinking. Another function, another patch update for the goggles is this idea that what's good for big business is good for me. Because big business in a weird and abstract way represents like accumulation of wealth, I think, right? The stock market and the economy become measures of health for a country at this point. Not infant mortality or, like quality of life stuff. It's like, how's the economy doing? What's their GDP? What do they create? What's their exports? Export, import. Business brain nerd shit, It's like, what the fuck? The conflation of corporate interests with national interests. But I'll leave it on a question here. Are we really a bunch of scared pussies who would snitch on each other if given the chance? Like, is that the basis that we should be operating from? Or maybe a better way of putting it is like, should we be basing our life decisions and our paradigms, our worldviews on theories made by economists? Are trans communist zombie people really stealing your pets? Or, think about it here, do the power elite just not want to pay as much in taxes? Resign from the corporate-sponsored playbook and politics as spectacle. Disentangle your identity from cultural signifiers. Stop fueling the fire of polarization and stop punching down at your fellow man. Instead, punch up at those in charge of the systems that suppress subversion and creativity and profit from the exploitations of humans and nature. Educate oneself on power structures. Consume dope art. Take care of your friends, family, and community. Do what you love and always fucking send it.